It's my honor to introduce our panelists, Noha Aboueldahab, visiting fellow from the Brookings Doha Center, Sultan Barakat to my left, director and professor of conflict management and humanitarian action program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, Bessma Momani, professor of the University of Waterloo, Balsillie School of International Affairs senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. And we're going to be waiting for RobertMalley, who's running a little bit late but will join us. He's the president of the International Crisis Group. And so, without further ado, we'd like to start with Noha, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the Arab Center Washington for having me here. It's a real pleasure. So my talk will focus on transitional justice in the Arab region and the centrality of criminal accountability, or the prosecution of political leaders, basically, following the Arab uprisings. But more specifically, what does it mean to pursue criminal accountability in the context of resurgent authoritarianism and ongoing conflict? Now, what do I mean by transitional justice? Of course, its definition continues to be debated, but for our purposes, basically, it's referring to addressing the past, right? Past atrocities, human rights violations, and social grievances. Many of you will remember over 7 years ago now the shocking live images of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in a courtroom cage alongside his sons and several Ministry of Interior officials. They were being tried for corruption and for the murder of peaceful protesters during the 2011 uprising. And a couple of months before that, former Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali was also tried for similar charges, but in absentia. And the International Criminal Court had issued arrest warrants for Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, his son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and the chief of intelligence, Abdullah Sunusi. And of course, we've since then seen additional ICC arrest warrants. Meanwhile, former Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh had agreed to step down in a deal that guaranteed his immunity from prosecution. Now, a lot of these leaders have either been freed or remain out of the reach of the courts, or they've been killed, or their whereabouts are pretty much anybody's guess. And so these cases not only challenge what I call mainstream transitional justice practice and scholarship, but they present some very valuable material that really calls for a rethinking of our expectations of transitional justice and how we understand its relationship with time. Transitional justice practice and scholarship has predominantly operated on the assumption that a transition constitutes a shift from violent authoritarian rule to liberal democratic rule. Now, of course, as we all know, that hasn't exactly been the case in the Arab region. And the examples from Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen and other places challenge the concept of transition and the concept of justice. And of course, these are not just concepts, they have very real consequences on the ground. So the challenge with transition stems from the fluid ways in which the Arab transitions unfolded, right? What's in a transition? What are we transitioning from, and what are we transitioning to? And the challenge with justice lies in the use of transitional justice as a battlefield by various actors with competing interests. And I group these two actors in two very broad categories. So on the one hand, you have lawyers, activists, civil society, using law to fight the injustice of the law, whether it's through pushing for transitional justice laws, pushing for prosecutions, and other forms of litigation activism. And on the other hand, you have the interim authorities, post-transition authorities, the military, the judiciary, and other elite actors using law to entrench authoritarian rule. And again, that's through passing repressive protest laws, passing controversial so-called reconciliation laws, and also the proliferation of laws, right? This obsessive enactment of law after law after law, whether it's amnesties, lustration, immunity, etc. So the resulting justice process is highly contentious. And while transitional justice has often been regarded as a post-conflict issue, with some very important exceptions, of course, it can and has been pursued in the context of authoritarian rule and ongoing conflict. Of course, what that justice means and what are the objectives of those who seek it is a complex issue, but I think part of the answer lies in the limited scope of the prosecutions that have taken place and the ones that continue to take place to this day. So when you look at the charges that were leveled at some of these leaders that I've mentioned, most of them have to do with crimes committed during the uprising period. So we're basically talking about a few weeks in the context of Egypt and Tunisia in particular. And of course, we saw a lot of corruption charges and charges having to do with socioeconomic crimes. So the reasons that the prosecutions were and continue to be limited in this way are fourfold. First, the prosecution of leaders such as Mubarak and Ben Ali were highly symbolic, right? In that these were heads of state that represented a legacy of decades of oppression. So they were effectively used as scapegoats to appease public anger and to give the impression that there's been a definitive break with the former regime. And secondly, as one person put it, it was a way to sacrifice a part of the regime to save the regime, and a way to protect the interim and post-transition authorities from being held criminally accountable for their role in past atrocities. And the limited scope of the criminal charges also served to portray the uprising period as an exceptional period, as though the decades of oppression that led to it didn't exist. And finally, the emphasis on corruption and socioeconomic crimes was, of course, in large part a result of decades of mobilization by workers' movements and labor unions. So, the daily visibility of corruption and unequal access to economic resources is a major factor in how a lot of people in the Arab region conceptualize injustice. So instead of addressing the past, there has been a reckoning with the transition itself. And the post-conflict dimension, or even the term transitional, constricts or really limits our ability to understand the reasons behind why transitional justice unfolded the way that it did. Now, of course, there's the important exception of the Truth and Dignity Commission in Tunisia. Its mandate allows for a reckoning with a sort of much larger scope of its history going back to 1955. And of course, it's no surprise that this immediately became a cause for concern for the Essebsi government, which was hell-bent on preventing the Truth Commission from pursuing its work, and then subsequently passed these controversial reconciliation laws. So the takeaway, or one of the takeaways here, is that law, of course, emancipates as it represses, and the legal enforcement of transitional justice is no exception to this. But I think perhaps a more important takeaway for our purposes is that transitional justice is a fluid process, not a definitive outcome. And victims are often and ironically overlooked in justice processes, and there's this very real dilemma of managing the justice expectations of victims and their families, who understandably seek a rapid and retributive justice. Now, of course, many would argue now is not the right time to pursue prosecutions, given the tumultuous transitions and authoritarian rule and ongoing conflict. But can we really look a victim in the eye, a victim who has suffered unspeakable torture, and say, now is not the right time, you need to wait until the right conditions are in place? If we were to wait, of course, we'd be waiting a very long time, which brings me to the final part of my talk on policy. So transitional justice policy needs to take the complexity of time into account. And what I mean by this is it can and it should be engaged in the immediate term without having to wait for this mythical democratic transition to occur. It just needs to be a little more creative. And this is exactly what Syrian actors have been doing through their documentation and also their litigation efforts. These are important efforts that not only pursue justice in the criminal sense, but they also seek truth, right? The truth about the fate of victims. And this incredible documentation movement led by Syrians has been very diverse. So you have professional documenters and you have ordinary citizens documenting and filing cases against alleged perpetrators. And while some would criticize this because they are concerned that the documentation procedures that are being pursued are not up to par with so-called international standards, I think this critique overlooks the power of this victim and survivor-led documentation movement. And the power of this material lies in the organic nature of the movement that generated it, which I think would enhance the legitimacy of whatever transitional justice mechanism eventually makes use of this material. So while criminal accountability in the form of trials quite clearly figures quite prominently in the justice psyche of Arab societies, expanding the pursuit of justice to include a combination of these processes, at the heart of which is documentation, but also purposive litigation, opens up some very powerful new possibilities for transitional justice in the Arab region. So if we think about justice in this way, when we look at the difficult examples of authoritarianism and ongoing conflict, then we may be a little bit more successful in managing justice expectations. Of course, one major obstacle to this is this collective, largely self-imposed, I think, amnesia at the societal level about past atrocities, which has, effectively buried any kind of meaningful public dialogue about addressing the past. But even then, documentation has become a justice mechanism in its own right, and it continues to be a powerful form of nonviolent resistance to ongoing violent conflict. And the fact that it can be pursued in the immediate term without having to wait for this ideal transition to emerge, whatever that transition is very empowering, I think, for victims and their families and for civil society more broadly. And I'll end my talk there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Noha. And now, if we can have Sultan, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vivian, and thank you for the Arab Center for inviting me here. I was asked to focus on the concept of state building post-conflict. What are the main barriers? And I'd like to address the issue at three levels. The first is conceptual, to do with what do we mean by a post-conflict state and what characteristic does it actually display. And the second is more practical in terms of the institutions and how do they operate and what are some of the challenges they face. And finally, in terms of at the regional level between states, what are the main obstacles for proper state building post-conflict. In my remarks, I'm really drawing a lot on practical engagement in a number of countries, a lot in Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, and the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. Although in the Arab world, we do have a number of cases of post-conflict states that have emerged, and I suspect that if we go back and check, we'll see that a lot of these issues that I will share with you have been demonstrated in those cases as well. The starting point is very much the nature of the political settlement reached that creates the state. And this is an issue that is often not considered carefully as to the way it carries in forming a state and in dictating the rhythm and the speed and the quality of the reconstruction that we hope to follow. And as a result, quite often, many of those post-conflict states revert back into conflict within an average of 5 to 6 years. And on average, we need at least 10 years for any reconstruction, meaningful reconstruction, to take place in any post-conflict context. The political settlements are increasingly reliant on negotiations and political agreement, and less so on clear victory. And this is something that we've seen in many contexts over the last 20 years, and we are now seeing it happening in the Arab world. Even if, as is the case in Syria, the regime feels is winning the war, in fact, the ultimate settlement will mean that there will be a lot of compromises. Those compromises produce a particular state that may not fit, and in fact does not fit, the standard image and understanding of what the state is there to do and how it does its day-to-day business. In terms of political settlement, one element that's often not highlighted is aside from the formal and informal institutions that are created through the settlement, there is the under-table agreements. No settlement has been reached without tying lots of loose ends that rely on either individuals or groups or former militia, and compromises have been made, even if they are not to be written in the agreement. They're just gentleman agreement, and I think Afghanistan is a very good example of that. But we are likely to see similar arrangements in Yemen as well, and we saw it in Yemen before, post its conflict with the Houthis. Now, those unwritten agreements lead to all kind of exceptionalism entering the structure or the craft of the state, including, unfortunately, in terms of justice as well, that they have to turn a blind eye to some individuals, some groups, and their action. But what it does overall, it does produce what we call fragile state. The concept of fragile state, to my mind, really risen in the aftermath of reaching political agreements in conflict-affected countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Afghanistan, Haiti, East Timor, all of which were the result of involvement of international donors, international powers, and a compromise that created the state. Few very important characteristics that these people have, unfortunately, to live with and manage through is, first, they do not have exclusive access or use of power or violence in order to guarantee order and security in their country. Quite often, there are more than one groups allowed to keep their weapons, maybe for some time, maybe for an next phase solution, and so on. And that, to start with, undermines the legitimacy of the use of power in that state. And of course, when we talk about states in general and their efficiency, we often refer to the two elements of legitimacy and ability to do their business. Now, those two elements are undermined by the fact that you have other armed groups running around in your country controlling areas. The moment they control areas, you lose total sovereignty over your territory. And quite often, in lots of these contexts, there are corners in the country that state institutions cannot reach. So state services cannot be delivered, the state justice system cannot be delivered, and that creates a whole range of complexity in itself. Now, if you don't have the exclusive use of power, of arms, you have no control over the territories, it follows that you don't have the ability really to govern relations between people and citizens in the state, and in particular in areas that are isolated. And you see that people have to go back to either traditional systems of governance, and in particular in terms of delivering justice. There is no rule of law. They go back to old systems, traditional systems. Many of those were part of the root causes of the conflict in the first place. So we end up feeding the system that had led to the area conflict, and certainly undermining any discussions that have taken place at the national level in terms of creating constitution, despite the fact that we spend enormous amount of money and time focused on two things at the beginning of post-conflict state building, and these are elections and constitution building. In my opinion, often rushed too fast into this process, but we undermine it at the lower levels through the inability to access those areas. The third factor that is absolutely detrimental has to do with resources, revenues, ability of the state to fund its operation, to guarantee its sovereign decision by having the ability to raise revenue internally. All countries that we know as post-conflict at the moment are reliant to one degree or the other at international aid. International aid is not in itself bad necessarily, but the way it is being delivered and the way certain percentages of it may be handed over to the state, bypassing the parliament and bypassing structures that you've set up in order to encourage accountability and good governance and so on, does mean that the state of governance is going to be protracted, the state of fragility is going to be protracted and will go further. We have many, many cases, and unfortunately I think the United States is particularly guilty of this, where they would allow a certain amount of aid to go through the parliament that they helped create, and a lot goes directly behind parliament in the name of security, in the name of stabilizing the office of the president, the office of the crown office, or the office of king of particular, and so on. Now, that does not help. What it does is it creates a dependency on this critical, even if it was a small margin of money, but it's a critical amount of money that is available directly in cash, no questioning, no methodology to spend it, nothing. This is the sort of money that everyone with a little bit of power would like to get hold of. We have also a problem in terms of managing expectations and managing people's need for expression of opinions and engaging in public discourses. State fragility of fragile states, all of them, as they move out of conflict, they do encourage freedom of speech to start with. And then very quickly they find that they hit a wall, that people are not able to draw a line between what can be said and what should not be said because you're infringing on somebody else's safety, security, culture, religion, etc. And we saw that happening in big way in Iraq following the American invasion. The number of satellite channels that have explored everywhere is absolutely incredible. And if you listen to the sort of discussion that they talk about Shiaism, Sunnism, this was never talked about in the past. And it's not about not wanting them to speak, is that there is no code of conduct. There is no feeling of being sensitive towards the other. It's a sort of thing that you would not allow maybe here in the US, certainly in Europe won't be allowed, because there will be code of conducts and standards and bodies that monitor what is being said and how it's been said. All of that is pushed aside in a fragile state, partly because there is no will to do so, partly because they conflict trying to regulate or trying to moralize what is being talked about with wanting to suppress opinions. And then we have another problem that very quickly comes into this, and it's liberal economics. There is this magic wand that everybody seems to agree on, and a lot of it comes from Washington, not necessarily the state, but the institutions, is that in day two, you must really encourage as much as possible liberal economics to take root in those countries, because this is the way you guarantee democracy, you guard democracy, people's participation, you open opportunities, etc., etc., etc. It's all fine and great, but in the aftermath of conflict, you must think who has the cash to invest, who has the cash to privatize, to buy those institutions that you privatize. We saw some horrendous examples in Bosnia, in Kosovo, of quick privatization of national industries that used to employ tens of thousands of people, and then they moved them all onto the safety net of the welfare arrangement of international NGOs in the name of good economics. And all they do is they buy the factory, they split it up, they sell it again, and it does create a huge unemployment problem. And when you think of the Arab world and what we heard earlier this morning about the need for employment, this is one area where we should really be treading very, very carefully not to sell out too fast and too quickly. We also have an issue we face an issue with civil society. Civil society in itself is great, but in many contexts, civil society was suppressed, and then the conflict led to unleashing the ability to engage, the willingness to engage, the want to engage. It gets distorted through one important aspect, and that is humanitarian assistance and relief. I don't know if people here have experience in that, but it's one of the biggest ills of post-conflict, is having had humanitarian assistance delivered consistently for 5 or 10 years into one country. It skews the whole arrangement within the economy, and in terms of civil society, it creates a rush to move away from independent civil society groups to create non-governmental organizations, NGOs, quite often house-based or family-based, all designed to help deliver aid to inaccessible areas that international community cannot reach. So that's all in terms of the broader conceptual discussion around what state building does mean in terms of in post-conflict. Now, assume that you're able to do this, then there's a whole range of dilemmas and questions that one has to address within that state and its institution. And I'll just very quickly, because I had the sign of running out of time, highlight some of those issues. One important aspect is capacity. Very few governments emerging from conflict or constituted as a result of political settlement have actually the capacity to manage the resources that is made available in the aftermath of conflict. What we've seen again and again is a sudden rise in resources, often following a conference, donors conference for Gaza, for Syria, for wherever. And then a few months into this process, a year into the process, this money and interest disappears. And it disappears for a number of reasons. One of them is that because a lot of these pledges are pledges, and unfortunately Arab states are particularly guilty of this. And one particular state, who I'm not going to name, is particularly guilty of this. And also because of a growing impression of corruption. We go back and blame those governments, say, well, you're corrupt. Of course they're going to be corrupt, because nobody invested in capacity development during the conflict. Very few contexts, and Syria has been an exception in this, that have received international attention during war to try and bring out young men and women to train them and prepare them for the days after conflict. There is very little ability to spot problems on the ground and as a government institution, and to be able to translate those into policies. And what follows is a total reliance on agency model, on the advisors, on the consultants, on the PricewaterhouseCoopers of this world, who get shipped in to do all the management on behalf of these civil servants, who spend all the time in country, manage to survive the whole war, only to be humiliated and pushed into a corner because you can no longer do this job, someone else will do it for you. And by doing so, we don't just push the locals, we create spoilers. These people become spoilers within the ministry for the overall programs. Now, I'll stop here in terms of these sort of institutions, and I'll just make a few more remarks at the regional level. As the Arab world, what we really need is the ability to come up with a regional vision. And I know it is a dreamy thing, it's idealistic, but we must continuously keep trying to talk about ways in which we can unleash resources from various corners of the Arab world and have them mixed together so that the development is possible. We have fantastic workforce, but they're all trapped. They have nil mobility. It is probably easier to come to the United States than to cross from one Arab country to the other to seek a job. We have a lot of resources in terms of energy. A lot of it is exported as raw material. Very little is being exploited in first, second, and third stage of development to provide jobs. And we must really take time to think about this. The Gulf states, they import workforce from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, in their millions. India on its own, I think, has 6 million people in the region. And we have millions of Arab youth stuck in their areas, unable to do anything. We have areas that is very fertile, agriculturally prosperous, etc., has the ability to produce food, and countries that import food from elsewhere. So this is really the main thing at the regional level. We need to try and maybe use the opportunity that now we have a number of countries emerging out of conflict to come up with a regional reconstruction strategy. And I don't shy away from looking back at what happened in the Marshall Plan. And I know it's become a bit of a cliche, but when you look at how the United States approached Europeans and encouraged cooperation as a result of this marginal amount of money that they've given, there's a lot there for us to learn from. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sultan. Before I ask Bessma to take the floor, I'd like to just extend a welcome to RobertMalley, who has managed to join us. Thank you. Good to have you. Please, Bessma, if you would.
So thank you, and I want to commend Al-Markaz Al-Arabi for putting on a great panels today and previously, and just want to make a shout out to thank you for ensuring that our panels are gender balanced. I think that's really important for Washington, D.C. think tanks to ensure that they have that, so thank you for doing that. So I'm going to talk about institution building and economic development, and I'm an international political economist by training, and so, the whole infamous idea or the idea that, a carpenter or a hammer sees things through only everything as a nail is going to be proven here, and that I see things through this IPE perspective, so bear with me here. But following what's been happening both in the Middle East and the global economy writ large, I think there are a lot of useful lessons to be learned that I think are applicable to our discussion about building the Arab world. In terms of institution building, and I think we all know when we talk about building institutions, we think of things like education, infrastructure, everything from libraries, roads, to parliaments, judiciary, healthcare. These are the essentials of the good society. I don't know of any society that is unable to provide this to its citizen and still be a happy place, a productive place, and frankly, one that many of us would be proud to be citizens of. So it is essential. It is essential to the core of any country to focus on building these types of institutions. But undoubtedly, they cost money. The fiscal space required to build these types of institutions is important. And increasingly globally today, we are in a system whereby, and again, I'm not going to give normative arguments about that global economy. The reality is there's less and less ability for countries to tax corporations for that. And so the fiscal space now is shifting away, or countries have to shift away from accessing corporate taxation to more individual and income and sales. And again, I can speak all day about how I think that's not a good thing for us, and many of us want to go back to an era and time when that wasn't the case. But the rules of the game have made it completely legal for corporations today to just avoid taxation, which again is not illegal, right? Tax avoidance is not illegal. It's not tax evasion, which is illegal. And that's part of the problem. And this is something that is not just happening in the Arab world, obviously it's happening here in the West. The rise of that, obviously, in the West means populism, which is this feeling of frustration, whereby there's less and less take-home pay, and yet there is so-called economic development all around us. And I try, when I speak about sort of the Arab Spring, I try to relate it back to how many of us in the West understand populism. That is the same essence of what was behind the Arab Spring. Economic development was all around. And this is really important because the way that we thought of economic development, and I'm going to be very blunt here, it's the way many of the Mideast leaders fixated on thinking about economic development, was in terms of real estate, was in terms of towers, was in terms of malls. I mean, these were very much false forms of modernization. But as long as we could point to the fact that you could get Starbucks at every corner in Amman, or that you could find Carrefour at every corner in Egypt, we seem to equate that with success and prosperity. And that is just not the case. And I think that's really important that when you look back at the Arab Spring, we had very strong growth numbers. Many of these countries, Egypt, for example, was growing at 5% per year GDP. That is a number that is many Western countries would be very, very jealous of today. Those are really strong growth numbers. And you can look at the data. The data is replete across the region. Every Arab country was growing, okay? But something wasn't right. What wasn't right is that it wasn't inclusive. It wasn't inclusive in that people did not feel it in their very pockets. So, I actually went to the point of suggesting that actually that's more frustrating. I think there's nothing more frustrating, and I look back at my teenage self, where we all sort of went to malls as a teenage young woman and not being able to buy everything you wanted. That's actually more frustrating, So the absence of those malls would have been so much better for political stability, if I'm going to be blunt here. Here's the challenge. The challenge is our leaders, the leaders of the Arab world, are similarly trapped in this model. They're fixated on these things. I had the pleasure of working with some urban planning firms, and when you talk to city planners, you ask them, sort of, what is the essence of what their leaders want to see? And they focused on this idea of, again, the built environment, towers, malls, resorts. I mean, it was just incredible to me. That fixation is a mentality we need to break in the region itself. When we look at one of the things that I think is important for us to think about in this new sort of global economic landscape of the decline of states able to actually get corporate taxation, is that it requires also a reality that you can't, in this great English saying, squeeze blood from a stone. Because if we're focusing on personal and sales tax, right, you get to the point where truly today, the Arab conundrum of many people on the street is they've got nothing left. You know, you can't squeeze blood out of a stone. And so it is destined to become a revolution. It's destined to become political instability. I don't know how many governments can't see that taxing more people when they've got nothing, when public wages continue to go down, when the very income levels of the average citizen in real terms, when you take inflation, when you take in all the cost of living and the rest, is diminishing rapidly for much of the Arab population. And this comes to a bigger problem. Look, I have heard this many times before as a student of political economy. People don't mind paying taxes. You know, this is something that I think that, you know, in the United States, where there is a great history of this. But, you know, we were taught as students of political economy, and I'm going back, you know, 25 years from my own, people don't mind paying taxes. What they do mind is paying taxes that aren't being used on them. Okay? So there's no problem here with charging taxes, but it needs to come back in terms of services. It needs to come back in terms of making the citizen feel like he or she has a stake in the game. And believe it or not, there have been actual candidates who have won on that platform. I am going to raise your taxes, but for that, I shall be providing X, Y, Z. The challenges in the Arab world is that taxes go up, but the services go down. And so that creates that essence of frustration that we're going to see, I think, come to head yet again. It came in the Arab Spring, and it's coming yet again. And so this is the challenge, and I think Rami Khouri in the last panel, you know, really just, you know, with this dichotomy of citizen and consumers. You know, I love that. That is just the perfect encapsulation of the problem, is that we were seen, or the Arab world was seen as consumers rather than being citizens. But you know, it's going to be the citizens that are paying the taxes. And so if they're not going to be regarded as citizens yet again, there is another political, call it what you will, you know, another political bomb going to explode in the region. And the Arab Spring was just one example of that. So how do you do that? Well, it requires institution building. You need to create the services that make that make them actually care to pay taxes into their system. It requires everything from waste removal. I mean, I think that people in the Middle East, I just came back from the Middle East, and you know, the one complaint that people had was, you know, my country, there's no waste removal. For those of you who know these big bins that collect the garbage, they're piling up high. Nobody picks it up. How can you expect your average citizen to pay taxes and you can't even pick up the basics of garbage? This is a fundamental crisis of confidence in government, and that does not lead well in terms of the long-term prospect. What can you do to give the people, to make them believe again? Transparency, accountability, open the books, let people see where their taxes are going to. Again, people are willing to pay taxes if they know it's being used to provide services, and that's just not the case today. So it's, again, a call to say, stop thinking of people as consumers and start thinking of people as citizens. I think, you know, this point that I mentioned earlier about this, you know, fixation on the built environment between things like towers and malls and the rest. Look, this is growth for the sake of growth itself, and that's not satisfactory. People want jobs. They want good jobs. They want an inclusive economy that obviously is bottom up. And I think there is some need to think about where this is going to come from. I myself have focused on things like the small and medium enterprise in the Middle East, which, you know, throughout the entire globe, in fact, one thing when I started researching found really quite surprising, most jobs are in the SME sector. They're actually not in the Googles and the Facebooks and the Walmarts. I mean, you think that they sort of come with these big giants. They don't. They come from the SME sector. And that is something that I think is very suitable to the Arab world because it's not going to be able to attract those corporate giants externally. It needs to focus on internal development. I would also add that I think women is an untapped opportunity in so many of these countries. It's a reality that I think, and I don't want to, I know someone's already flashed me a time card, but including women in the economy is an economic plus. It's been proven study after study after study. You get more women in the economy, you get a more productive economy. And today, the barriers on women in the Middle East to enter the labor force are unbelievable. One of the biggest ones, transportation. I mean, talk about this vicious cycle, right? Safe transportation that women can take to get into the formal economy is one of the biggest impediments on women. I mean, the previous panel talked about education. Yes, I agree, but there are so many educated people in the Arab region, and I think we can point to this, university educated who don't have jobs, who don't have access to get to the city, who don't have the $2 it takes to get to the city to look for work. So transportation is an investment that the government can give into. When people start seeing their roads operate, when they start seeing a public transportation system, again, that's the use of your tax dollars, and produced into something of tangible benefit to them, they start to say, hey, yes, my taxation is going to some use. Last thing I would just point out is that I think we have obviously seen the Arab world go through, and I think there's still, the history is out. It's still not, I think, at a point where we can say whether the Arab Spring was a good thing or a bad thing. I personally believe it was a good thing for the region. I think it was a wake-up call. I think it was imperative on governments of the region to recognize that they have untapped potential, particularly of young people who have been ignored. And I think there's lessons to be learned. And that is really investing in these kinds of institutions to create the economic development that the region needs. And to sort of continue with this false narrative that, you know, we have to create political stability first before creating economic development, or this false choice that economic, development produces political stability. Neither of one has to be, either or. They have to come together. And I think there's enormous opportunity for that, but it requires leaders who see growth in the terms of its people. They cannot look on their landscape in their high-rise towers and look around and see the built environment and think that's development. If we can't get that out of their heads, of the policymakers, I don't see a future for the Middle East. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Bessma. Last but certainly not least, at least for the speaking portion, prepared remarks, Robert, please go ahead.
Thank you. And first, I want to apologize for being late. I went to the wrong place, so you could imagine the face of the audience when I started talking about Arab state building. But as a price for being late, I'll try to be brief, because I realize that we need some time for questions and answers. I'm going to take this from a slightly different angle, if only because I'm not as much of an expert as all three panelists on the issues that they were discussing. I want to look at the role of third parties, the West, but not just the West, in what I'm going to call in a very simplistic way, the arc of the state of the Arab state, from over-centralization to fragmentation, and they overlooked, or what we've overlooked is the central stage, which should be the one that we should aiming at, is what I'd call decentralization. Starting from the first phase, which is over-centralization, I think that's a case that we've seen throughout the Arab world, and to a large extent, it's not the only cause, but it's one of the causes behind the Arab Spring. I think we heard just from Bessma the notion of the citizen being not treated as a citizen and feeling alien from his or her ruler, seen as other and seen as accountable to and bankrolled by an other who is not even of their own country, outsiders, Western capitals for the most part. And it becomes a game of mutually reinforcing dynamics where obviously local leaders want to centralize power and accumulate power and not share it. And the foreign actors, Western or non-Western, like to support, bankroll, empower, enable the one leader who's going to, in turn, provide them with what they need, whether it's political benefits, security benefits, or material benefits. And we've seen that, and that produces states that tend to be under-inclusive, non-representative, autocratic, overly repressive, and as I said, lead to feelings of marginalization, alienation on the part of local populations. And the Arab Spring, again, many reasons behind it, but one was, in my view, a sense of frustration, alienation at a state that they didn't recognize as their own anymore. And once that achieves a critical mass, once the state is viewed as non-legitimate, as other, the events that we saw followed. And one could think of the case of Egypt, of Tunisia, of Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So we went from that stage. Second, the stage to which and as I say, we skipped what would have been probably the more fruitful stage, we went to the stage of state fragmentation. Case in point, Exhibit A obviously is Iraq. Now that is a separate case. The U.S. played a direct role in shattering the structures of the state, disbanding the security service, and then dividing and allocating power along sectarian ethnic lines. But even in other cases, if you look at the landscape today of the Arab world, it's quite striking. Duplication of security forces across the board. Duplication of security forces, obviously in a place like Yemen. Duplication of security forces in Lebanon. Duplications of security forces in Syria. Proliferation of security forces in Syria. Proliferation in Yemen. In Palestine, between the security forces of Hamas, security forces of the PA, and of course in Iraq with the Hashishabi on the one hand, and the state security forces and the Kurdish forces as well. Again, a game of mutually reinforcing trends where local actors want to take advantage of the ability to be more influential and have more power and have more resources, so they form their own militia or their own armed gangs or their own mini-military, and foreign actors who see in them a good conduit, a good vehicle to promote their own interests, whether those interests are counterterrorism, if you look at what the U.S. is doing in Syria by supporting the Kurds, or other forces are doing in Libya, or of an ideological type, where the divide between Islamists and non-Islamists, the divide between the pro-Iranian and the anti-Iranian forces, mean that these states, these countries, are seeing their security forces proliferate and being both bankrolled and being given material support. Again, just look at what's happening today in Libya, look at what's happening today in Yemen, look at what's happening today in Palestine. In one case after another, you see these security forces. I don't know, it's hard always to know how to describe them. They're quasi-state, they're quasi-militia, sometimes they're non-state forces. It's gone beyond that. It's not just security forces. It's also the treasury. It's also the means of economic subsistence, where you see the central banks in Libya and in Yemen torn apart. You see the oil sector in Libya being divided up. So you're also seeing the economic resources of the country, the means of payment of salaries that are being divided for local reasons, because different forces want to take advantage of and want to profit from the control of the banks or one branch of the bank, and by regional actors, which are also trying to either prop up their side or starve the other. And Yemen, of course, is on that one the prime and most dramatic and tragic example. And last, it's not just security, it's not just finance, it's political legitimacy itself, where you see different countries backing different types of, or different governments or aspirational governments. Whether it's in a place like Libya, between what's happening in the east and what's happening in Tripoli, when you look at what's happening in Yemen, between what the Houthi and the government of Hadi, but also let's see what happens in the south and whether some form of governance emerges there, whether it's in Iraq with the KRG, again, whether it's in Palestine with the Hamas government and the government of the PA. So forms of legitimacy themselves, the claims of legitimacy, the claims of representation also get divided and get exacerbated by outside actors for all the reasons that I described above. So the real question, I think, for one of the main questions, other than all the very good ones that have been raised so far, is for foreign actors who want to play a helpful, as opposed to what has been for the most part unhelpful hand in helping rebuild Arab states, is finding that equilibrium between preserving the state and decentralizing it, decentralizing forms of government. I think we've seen across the board that hyper-centralized states simply don't satisfy the needs of citizens. They don't recognize the needs of citizens. They don't represent certain ethnic groups and sectarian groups. Of course, there needs to be the state. It needs to have its prerogatives, but what are we going to do to accommodate the needs for self-governance, the needs for policing, particularly in a post-conflict situation where the bonds of trust, however fragile they may have been, have completely dissipated. And you now have, in many of these countries, segments of the population that don't recognize themselves at all in those in power, and who are going to recognize themselves even less as repression continues, and even once the war comes to an end. So for outside actors, who do they help? Who do they support? Not trying to undermine the central state, but at the same time understanding that the state of yesteryear, whether it's in Syria or across the Middle East, the Arab world, is not going to be tomorrow, but how can you support decentralized forms of governance without undermining what has to be still, in order to provide for citizens across the country, a strong and robust state? I'll end there.
Thank you so much, everyone. So I personally have about 15 questions for each of our speakers, but I will use my authority here with the mic to ask the first question, and since Robert's time was a little bit cut short, I'm going to ask him a question to comment on something that Sultan said, because I'm a troublemaker. So Sultan actually mentioned that he said that humanitarian aid sometimes can be one of the biggest ills of the post-conflict system. You know, I know from my experience in covering the Middle East, a lot of countries wouldn't be where they are today without American assistance, outside the United Nations, any of these agencies. And so I would love to hear both of you kind of elaborate on that point a little bit, both your opinion and also if you can elaborate. What's the alternative then? You know, do we leave them to sort of find their way, and maybe they don't, maybe they do? President Trump certainly has said he's willing to sort of let them find their own way. He's not interested in state building. He said it multiple times. And so what's the alternative, if not, at least in the early stages, a humanitarian effort to prop them back up on their feet a little bit?
So, I mean, I want to hear Sultan. I'll just say a few words on it, and of course,
Please, both of you.
President Trump,
I invite both of you. I
President
invite
Trump,
both of
for
you.
the most part, when he said no aid, he's talking about the Palestinians, and we could talk about the distortive effects that assistance has had in the Palestinian case. I think we could have a whole full hour on that. And you know, on the one hand, obviously one welcomes humanitarian assistance, but propping up and bankrolling the occupation, which to a large extent has been what so much of the assistance to the Palestinian Authority has meant. I think there's real, very profound questions about that. I don't think that's what Sultan was referring to. I think more broadly, there have been distorting effects of assistance. I think that it has created interest groups that benefit from aid, others that don't have the same ability to access that assistance. Again, I'm not an expert on international assistance, but it has struck me over time, certainly when you look at some of the amounts of aid that have been poured in and how little it has trickled down, if that's the expression, or helped average citizens, that particularly in states that are not particularly representative, where there is high levels of corruption, where there's high levels of inequity, assistance tends to channel through those states, and you reproduce the same inequities and same lack of inclusivity that pre-existed the infusion of aid. So, but I know Sultan has probably more to say on that.
I found it striking, so I'd love to hear more.
I actually made the comment in relation to state building. So it's very harmful to the formation and the development of legitimacy and authority of the state. Now, in itself, of course, it's badly needed, and in some conflict, people are desperate, and we should do everything to allow humanitarian aid in. It becomes problematic when you go into protracted conflicts, and humanitarian aid provides the outsiders, the third party, with good consciousness, instead of acting to resolve the conflict or bringing an end to the war. And this is where it becomes very, very damaging to everything. Food aid gets people off their fields. It hits the local market. It comes here free from the US, shipped to those countries. It goes into their economy system. It can end up in warlords' hands, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite complex. It creates an economy of its own. But most importantly, it encourages dependency on outside. It discourages people from working their own fields, providing for themselves. And it distorts any system that existed in the country, say in health, education. In education, every donor provides support for a program that follows their own curriculum. So you end up in a country like Syria, 100 different curricula being taught. The health system is the same, the different standards being applied. And in the absence of a strong state, this is normal. This is what happens. Now, the answer, of course, is not to say we don't need humanitarian aid. Is we need it to be delivered in a slightly different way. It has to be part of a structured approach to the conflict so that the focus is really on bringing an end to the conflict, and humanitarian aid follows. And as a region, I think the Arab world should work more on providing its own humanitarian assistance that is at least culturally appropriate. We have a lot of cultural problems with what is coming from basic provision of shelters all the way to food. You go to Yemen now and people are spending a lot of time trying to boil black bean. It's just impossible to do. You don't have enough wood to cut and to bring it to the point where you can eat it, never mind anything else. And like that, there are a lot of examples that one can talk about. And I think the real problem in the Arab world lies with us. We have not invested in understanding humanitarian aid, in training our young men and women to be at the front line of delivering assistance, designing programs, and so on. So I'm not blaming it on the internationals.
Right. No,
Yeah.
of course. So I'll turn the questions now to the audience. We have a question here from Paul Tyson from the New England College. He says, this is actually directed to Noha and to Sultan. What is the role for traditional and religious justice systems in the Arab states and transitional justice? The role of traditional religious justice systems in the Arab states.
No, you start.
All right, thank you for the question. Traditional and religious. I mean, I think it depends on the country, but I think instead of referring to it as traditional or religious, I think I would prefer to refer to it as local mechanisms, which in Yemen, for example, have always played a very important role in not just transitional justice, but conflict resolution, and I guess you can't really separate the two. And so, it's just, for obvious reasons, it's difficult for such local mechanisms to address the scale of atrocities that have been taking place. And so I think that their reach is limited in that sense. So if you have widespread, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and so on, these local mechanisms are never going to be sufficient enough to address those. And so certainly they're important, but they need to be complemented with other mechanisms, whether they're at the national level or regional level or international level, to adequately address the scale of the atrocities that some of these countries are facing.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, traditional systems always existed and have been working or at work all the time, particularly in isolated areas where state institutions have not been established, even in normal areas. So you go before the whole transition of the Arab Spring, Egypt, Upper Egypt, lots of areas, farmers used to fight each other over water supply, dividing the water between them, and one angry farmer would hit the other over the head, and he's dead. People do not go to court because they understood, A, it is expensive to go to court, B, it will take years to resolve the issue. Meanwhile, you cannot work the water, you cannot work your field, you cannot reach a settlement. So they relied on traditional forms of conflict resolution and settlement. And it's been effective at that level. The difficulty, I think, in terms of state building is when the international community comes in and they see this all kind of working at the local level, they say, oh, this is very exciting. Let's now use it at the national level. And we expect too much of some of those actors in terms of delivering output, and we really undercut them when they badly need us. Take, for example, Darfur. There were traditional conflict resolution models were employed heavily in Darfur. But when it came to compensation, paying compensation or reparation, which is very central to the whole traditional system, if somebody is killed, there is a fidya for his family from the other party and so on, everybody pretended there's no money. So they really exposed those traditional leaders, and then they let them down, and as a result, they got withdrawn. Yemen, they do it on a daily basis, again and again and again. Today in Yemen, they are brought in, part of the discussion, and then they let down. And it has reached the stage in a country like Jordan, for example. Now the state has to go and use the traditional system in order to forgive its own members, military, for having killed or injured one citizen. Now, this has gone, I think, a bit too far in terms of state legitimacy and authority, that there's a lot of confusion going on.
Okay, thank you. The next question addressed to Professor Momani. You all are far more polite than me. I've been using first names. Apologies to Bessma. From Mohammed Shinawi of Voice of America, VOA. President Sisi is focusing on mega projects, adding huge debts to the Egyptian shoulders from an economic point of view. Is that the right way to build Egypt?
Mohammed, you know my answer.
Let's get everyone involved, please.
You know my answer, Mohammed, on that. Absolutely not. In fact, one of the things, and at the time we watched the Suez Canal expansion, was the most ridiculous, unbelievable waste of money I had ever seen. At the time when the global economy is going down, when shipping routes between, frankly, China and Europe, which is what you're connecting, is in decline because Europe is having a demographic decline and in its own economic crisis. At a time when, frankly, you have a monopoly, Egypt had a monopoly of this valuable Suez Canal. There was no value in creating an expansion for it. It was just ridiculous. It was an absolute waste of money. But it's a perfect example, and I was there at the time of Iftitah, the Suez Canal. Oh my God. You could not get a more celebratory, it was like reliving Nasser all over again, the sort of joy that Sisi and those around him had in fulfilling this great moment. I mean, it was just theatrics, but it was a perfect par example of how state building doesn't focus on what people need. Transportation in Egypt is abysmal. Public parks, I think one of the things, if I had an ounce of influence in the Arab world, it would be, for the love of God, build some public parks for the people. People are dying for a public park. You know, how cheap is it to put a public park up with a swing set for kids? I mean, this is the essence of anyone with, some modicum of understanding of public policy and responsibility would invest in these things. Not saddle the entire Egyptian people, who paid for it, by the way, right? They raised basically bonds from the people that the government cannot pay back now. And I mean, it's just incredible. But this is the kind of obsession with big mega projects. Today it's relocating the capital because the old capital has too many poor people. So we'll just build a new one, Akhir ad-Dunya, so nobody will notice nobody can afford to live there that are actually going to work there. But it's going to be a shiny new capital that we can put in a brochure. I mean, this is the fixation of leaders, of policymakers. And unfortunately, it's to their own detriment in the long run.
So that was no.
That was a no.
The next question, and we are coming a little bit close to our time, but we still have a couple more questions. Brett Boren is asking to Noha, what role does the lack of an independent media in the Arab world, this was my second question that I was thinking of asking them, what role does the lack of an independent media in the Arab world play in the lack of transitional justice? And what can be done to strengthen local media? I like that one.
Thank you for the question. Well, I mean, I think the role of the non-independent media is obvious in the sense that, it hasn't helped this. It hasn't helped two things. One is the collective amnesia that I referred to earlier about past atrocities. Sort of, you see it not just in Egypt but in Libya as well. This longing for the days of Gaddafi, longing for the days of Mubarak. And so obviously this non-independent media has perpetuated that. But it's also contributed to the hijacking of narratives about the past, which, are sort of engineered at the elite level and sort of buttressed by this non-independent media. And it's had some very, very real consequences. So, going back to what I said earlier about portraying the transitions as an exceptional period. You can see that in the trials that have been happening lately in Egypt, the trials of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the trials of also non-Muslim Brotherhood people as well. And so all of this, exacerbates this hijacking of narratives about the past, which in turn is bought by society that pays any kind of attention to these independent, non-independent media outlets. But I think that one of the positive outcomes of 2011 is the proliferation of independent media outlets. I know that obviously there's been a major crackdown on these independent media outlets, but they do, exist in a certain sense, and social media has facilitated that. Now, I'm no media expert, but I really think that this is an important positive outcome, and it continues to play a crucial role in informing the public about what's happening, whether it's transitional justice or other issues. And the third thing I'd like to add to that is the role of the diaspora, or diaspora is a very sort of loaded term, but like Syrians outside of Syria, Yemenis outside of Yemen, who I think could be doing a lot more, actually, Egyptians outside of Egypt, etc. And so the role of that sort of part of the population is crucial, really, in whether it's in state building, preserving narratives or accounts of what has happened in the past, and this is exactly what the Syrians have been doing in a really brilliant way, both inside Syria and outside Syria. They found ways during this, unbelievably devastating war to work together to document. And it's, as I said earlier, it's not just to prosecute, right? It's to preserve memory, it's to preserve various, multiple accounts of what has happened. And this is crucial for the future, which goes back to the point I was making earlier about time, right? And so even if we don't see immediate prosecutions happening now, genuine ones, this collection of material, of accounts, is crucial over time, and could very well be effectively used decades later, hopefully sooner.
Great. I think I can get one more in under the wire if everyone keeps their responses super brief, but we have one from Shireen Tedros from Amnesty International. I'm going to open it actually to all of you. Given the protracted conflicts in the region right now, what avenues for justice and accountability are there? And she says, do we have to wait for Syria to be post-conflict before there is justice? Where do we get this justice? I thought that was a nice one to end on.
Easy.
Anyone have any thoughts that we can wrap up in 30 seconds?
I mean, I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the avenues are, the wheels are already turning. And it also depends on how you view justice, right? So for some Syrians, especially the ones that have been filing cases in Germany and Sweden, they've been extremely successful. A couple of arrest warrants have been issued. Sure, they probably won't see those individuals in court, physically in court, but they'll, if you talk to some of them, they'll probably say, well, just the fact that they've been named in this arrest warrant for now is somewhat of a victory. And so waiting for a conflict to end, I don't think is the right approach. I'll just leave it there. 30 seconds.
Well, I think you'll agree that. Oh, sorry, Robert. Did you want to chime in?
No,
okay.
I come from a conflict resolution organization, and so I think, and I agree with everything that was said. One thing I think we do have to bear in mind, and it's not always the least controversial thing to say, is that at some points they are. You got to make a choice, at least temporarily, between accountability and stability, peaceful resolution. Mm-hmm. And that's, it's a dilemma that we face in countless cases, not just in the Middle East. And I don't think it's always an easy balance between seeking justice, mm-hmm. but also finding ways of ensuring that the conflict doesn't go on.
I think we need to focus more on the quality of the evidence and less on the quantity of the evidence. I think there is this thing about circles of justice and transitional justice is they want to deliver justice to absolutely everyone. And I understand the reasons for that. But the problem is when you spread your resources during conflict, gathering evidence, very often the evidence is indismissible in court, and you don't really pin down those criminals. If you focus on the quality, even if there was a murder of one or two people, you can actually move forward much faster.
Thank you all for joining us. I think you can agree that it's a hefty topic, so they did a great job. Please join us for a coffee break outside and meet back here in 15 minutes, please, for the final session, Beyond Sectarianism Toward Inclusive Citizenship in Arab Societies.
And thank you to you.